welcome to Reaction Norm. I am Patricia Vino, and I am joined today with my two esteemed colleagues, Michael McConkey and Charles. Hi, guys. How are you?
Hello.
Hey,
I'm fine.
how's it going?
Yeah, good.
Great,
Good.
great. So, I am hosting my first episode today. Michael usually hosts for us, and he does an excellent job at that. But I think coax me to take on a little bit more of the shared workload of the podcast. I'm giving it a try this week, so bear with me, everybody, but I'm really excited about it. And today we're going to be talking about IQ and intelligence and some of that, how that's turned up in the news and whatnot lately. The irony that of the three of us, I would be hosting the IQ or intelligence episode is not lost on me. But I think it's going to be fun anyways. So shall we get started, guys?
Yeah, ready to go.
All right, great. So where I thought there's a few things that I'd like to do today. So I thought I would just take you through where I'm hoping to go with this today. I wanted to talk about some of the controversy that pops up when you see things to do with IQ and intelligence research in the news, and why people sort of tend to get really nervous about IQ research and what it finds, and why there's always this accusation that it's junk science. And then so I think that will naturally lead us into a discussion of sort of what some of the current research says. And then I'm hoping we can get into a bit of the evolutionary aspect of why humans have evolved intelligence and how that's helped us survive up until this point, and then maybe some practical take-homes of what we can do, with regard to our own IQ, and if that's something that we can change or think about that. So does that sound like an okay overview? I hope we'll have enough time to do that. But is there anything else that you guys were hoping to talk about or add? Or shall we dive right in?
I say let's dive in. That all sounds good to me.
All right. Sounds good. So in the news, whenever you see some sort of headline, we'll get into a discussion more of what sort of IQ and intelligence is, and general intelligence in a minute. But one thing that I feel like comes up over and over again in the news is the difference between people or populations on Earth. If there is difference in IQ, it cannot have a genetic basis. And this is something that Michael just forwarded me an article in the Telegraph this week saying that whatever difference there is between different people, this is all due to the environment, and it can't be based on genes. I don't know about you guys. I don't understand why one is better than the other. Being that you have to categorically say that it cannot be genetic, but it can be environment. I mean, it doesn't seem to change the outcome. Does it?
Well, there's a few things that to say off the top there in terms of the anxiety people have about intelligence. I think on one level, it's just a really visceral anxiety about the possibility that somehow we're not all naturally equal or naturally capable of being equal. So just the existence, just the claim that some people have an advantage wherever it comes from makes people uncomfortable. And this is why you get arguments about, but there's different kinds of intelligence, right? Some people have more of this kind, and some people have more of my son, when he was young, went to a Waldorf school. But anyways, that was part of their philosophy. They really push it like, well, the kids are all equal. Some will do better in some areas, and some will do better in other, this sort of thing, right? So I think that's part of the anxiety. But yeah, I agree with you. The anxiety heightens, becomes accelerated once you start talking about the connection to the possibility that it can be genetic. And of course, even what the term genetic means to people is not always clear what people exactly mean by that. But I think that what bothers people about that is the perception that that they lose something of their notion of I don't know if free will is exactly the right word, but some sort of autonomous possibility. I mean, like if it's in my genes, then there's nothing that I can do about it, and people don't like the feeling, I guess, disempowerment or something, like it's some kind of metaphysical or disempowerment or something that makes people uncomfortable.
I
But
think that last part that you said, that if it's in the genes, then there's nothing you can do about it. I think that's more what a lot of people worry about.
So the
yeah,
fact that it's almost deterministic would be.
yeah, yeah, and then you start bringing into the whole issue of populations and how populations end up with different different averages, IQs, and then you get into, then it starts getting really, really thorny in terms
But
of
do you
what
see that?
what people. I'm sorry, just let me finish. In terms of what people aspire for, what they think of as a good society, and what they aspire for, it not only becomes complicated, you begin to think it might be impossible.
Yeah,
But
there's also other things, like some people focus on averages because on an individual basis, they might not be able to paint the narrative they want to paint, right?
right, yeah. But I mean, at the same time, by the time, if you're going to take a snapshot of the population at any time, whether there are differences, whether they were due to the environment or to some sort of genetic basis, I mean, that doesn't change the fact that you're finding differences.
Yeah, and I think that like you were asking before, Patricia, about the resonance about this, and of course the thing that usually comes up is that well, the Nazis were, this is how the Nazis thought, right? And we know where that led, right? That led to a really bad place, But the problem, of course, is that with this kind of thinking, of course, is that you can take it, and I think this is what you were alluding to in your earlier question, is that well, you could take let's take the radical environmentalist point of view. Let's take the point of view that genes have nothing to do with it, and it's all from environment. Well, that was pretty much the position of the Marxists and the Soviet government. We talked about this in an earlier episode, talked about Lysenko and this sort of total denial of genetic influence in the Soviet Union. And so there's an example of a radical environmentalist position. Did that turn out a lot better than the Nazis experiment turned out? Like it's not like whether you're an environmentalist or a hereditarian doesn't exclude the possibility of murderous totalitarianism. It's not like one excludes the other. They're both possible under whichever philosophy you're operating, or whichever
right. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it seems to me that we've taken like a good position, that we've sort of come across as a society be like this, and we don't want to discriminate against people, between people, and that's fine. But that has sort of taken a conceptual leap to say now, well, there's actually no differences between people.
The thing is, like, if you have a population difference, that does not mean you discriminate between individuals, right?
Exactly. Well, exactly. That doesn't mean you have to pretend that they're all the same.
Right, but like, for example, like if you're deciding whether to hire someone as, I don't know, a physicist or a software engineer or a data scientist or something like that, you're judging that individual's IQ. If that person being in a group, a much larger group with, say, hundreds of thousands of people or millions of people, that average is irrelevant, right? Because you're judging this person on their own personal merits, right? So it's like, who cares like what the average is in terms of like operational, being operational in terms of like hiring decisions or whatever, right? Like it's irrelevant.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, like I want to qualify that a little bit, and of course, and people say that all the time, and I have said that in the past, and there's the level at which that's true, but it's also true that if a particular population, if you say an average of population is true, any one person from that average, for that population, you don't know where they're going to fall in the distribution. Obviously, that's true. But
Correct.
if you had to lay money on it, right? If you had to bet what it was, your smartest bet would be bet close to the average of the population, right?
So that's only if you don't know anything about that person.
If you don't know, that's right. If you don't know anything else about them, that's right. Right. And this is why you get into the situation where people fall into, and I agree with you, this is a mistake, but this is why people fall into the tendency to assume that when they meet an individual from a group, if they know something about the group, they tend to make these assumptions. This is what we call prejudice, right? This is this is literally what prejudice is, but is not without any kind of statistical foundation to make it, right? So this is where things get complicated, right?
Right.
Go ahead.
Oh, no. I was just kind of summing up what Michael said, and I feel like you're going to build on it more. But it's just, Michael and I have talked about this. It's not whether the fact should exist or not. Science is always about what you do with it, right? Like just exploring something for the sake of knowing more about something. You can't really moralize the science. I mean, I feel like this is something that we always bang out about here. But sorry, Charles, continue.
Yeah. So I mean, there's the aspect of researchers studying this stuff, and is this stuff predictive? Is it useful? Anything like that? And then there's like, do people who are, for example, not specialists in that field, how do they make use of this, right? And for a lot of people, like what Michael was saying, if you know nothing about the person, then they come from this population. Like, I'll give an example. Let's say we know nothing about the person, but they're an elementary school teacher. We can make some assumptions about like what their intelligence might be. Now, there can be an individual who has a very different one, but if I know nothing else about that person with that, you might make a bet that way. But often in practice, you have a lot of other information, right? Like if you're making a hire decision, I have this person's resume, maybe they have some reputation, maybe there's people who work with them before, like I can make a much more informed decision. And like it's not something that's relevant probably at that point, right? Yeah, I guess my point is people researching this and finding some of it useful for some things is a separate question from like what people do in terms of like hiring decisions or anything else that might, come about around this.
And
absolutely.
Can I just stick a point in there too,
absolutely.
Though? Because because we're talking about at the level of individual, and often I think the three of us have a similar philosophical outlook, and it's understandable that we would banging into my microphone, and where we, it's understandable that we're very concerned to emphasize that prejudice against individuals on the basis of group characteristics isn't appropriate, right? But but of course there is another value in this that shouldn't be underestimated, is that it does provide an important insight in terms of thinking critically about larger social processes, because when those groups start manifesting at their averages and you get different kinds of social outcomes, then it gives you an insight that might provide an explanation that's different than the explanation that is usually provided for those who don't want to take seriously questions of intelligence and genetics and things like that, right? So it's really valuable. We don't want to make the mistake of generalizing the group to the individual, but that doesn't mean that you can. And by the way, and that's one of the reasons why a lot of people condemn talking about intelligence, because they're afraid everyone's going to do that. And I don't think that's true, but it could be, it's possible. But that doesn't mean that you can exclude taking account of this stuff if you're talking about social analysis and public policy and those kind of questions. That do those kind of analysis without taking account of group averages and things like intelligence is just malpractice.
Yeah, so I would agree with that too. Like I said, like I don't think these two things are like mutually exclusive, that you have to behave one way just because you find that an average is predictive of something. And it's not always necessarily the average. There's other kind of group level aggregates that you might be interested in. Like, for example, like there's the smart fraction theory or creative class or whatever it's called. That's not really the average that matters. It's the percentage of the smart fraction or whatever. But yeah, those dynamics are interesting too. So, I mean, there is kind of like this predictive power it seems to have, and you can debate how good it is, or how good the predictive power is. But there's also how it affects how you treat individuals too. And those are, to me, those are two separate things.
Right.
Yeah. And I'm trying to make that point, actually. Yeah, they're two separate things that both have to be kept in mind.
Right. But you actually, you touched on a good thing, Charles, that I want to just circle back to, is one of the reasons that sort of IQ and intelligence testing is useful is that it has been shown to have predictive power. So maybe should we get into a little bit about sort of what we're really talking about when we talk about intelligence, general intelligence, IQ. Some people use these terms interchangeably. Some people get like really uppity about like, well, IQ is just a number. And so I think that probably we should have a discussion about what we're really talking about here, now that we've sort of made a bit of a case for why this is like a valid thing to research.
Okay, so I can go in a bit of the history of it. So in the past, I don't know exactly the dates, but they were looking at students and they were trying to figure out which students need special education. And there's two kinds of special education. There's maybe, the student's a bit slower and they need a bit of help, and there's that kind of special education. But maybe also the student's a bit quicker, right? And that also means they need special education too, because like if you put any of those students in a normal class, and normal is like what most people are doing, they're either going to be left behind or they're going to get bored or whatever. It's not going to be useful to them. And in the past, what they did is they created tests for different types of things. And then I don't remember the exact test, but I think it was something like, math tests, reading tests, science tests, whatever. And they discovered something they didn't expect. And the thing they discovered is if you did well at one test, you tended to do well at all tests, right? And for example, it doesn't mean, for example, if I got 1 point higher than Michael on this one test, I get 1 point higher in every test, right? It could vary a bit, right? But what they found is you like in a kind of fuzzy sense, you tend to do well at all tests, right? I've heard people argue that this isn't true for every individual. Like strictly speaking, it's true for most individuals. That's a separate topic we can get into a little later. But what it seems that these things, in a technical sense, they say they correlate, right? And the concept of general intelligence, concept of the Spearman factor, this kind of concept arises out of this correlation, that there's something, well, that exists is a empirical finding. And then the question is, what is this, right? Like, what is this thing? Why do they correlate? Now, one thing people have kind of drawn from this, and you can debate this, and reasonable people do, although there's unreasonable people that debate it too. One thing that you draw from this is that there might be something driving all these different kinds of intelligence, right? Like a general factor, a general intelligence. And well, what is that, right? And now, so that's one part. Let's put that aside. There's also different theories around intelligence, right? And I think some of it gets confusing because people, when they talk about intelligence, sometimes they're talking about different things, right? Like you have this concept that we have of like, that you kind of draw from that correlation of general intelligence. But if you get into, like the evolutionary psychology type stuff, they also talk about these domain-specific problem-solving things instead of kind of like a raw engine horsepower, right? And those seem like different things to me, although they are related, right? Putting that to aside, one of the theories around general intelligence is that there's a concept of fluid intelligence and there's a concept of crystal intelligence, right? And some people argue, I think the most people argue that are specialists in the fields, that what you find in terms of this Spearman factor, in terms of this like this factor within the correlations for all these IQ tests, is that that's probably related more to fluid intelligence. Now, there are some people that debate that. They also debate whether that's still true in the developing world. But this is where that kind of comes from. Now, just a few other things. People often use IQ for all these things. IQ was a specific kind of test. It's not in use anymore. But because the name they might use, like cognitive battery of questions or something like that, is just a mouthful, people still stick with IQ test or IQ rather than saying what they, a specialist might actually use. Some other things, for example, like if you took the same IQ test, like the same individual took it, like you'd probably get different scores like each time you took it. Are you hungry? Are you tired? Who gave you the test? So measuring this is there's nuance to how this gets measured. There's nuance to how you derive this number. Like, do you take the average of it? Do you take the top number? Et cetera, et cetera.
Can I just try and interrupt you just for a second to try and sort of summarize what you've said? So, and correct me if I'm wrong. So IQ tests are not in use anymore, but we can use them colloquially to refer to like the physical test that you might take.
Yeah, so people still call these tests IQ tests. Technically, it's not what they are. Like the Ravens test, but there's other ones too.
Right. And you would say that for what IQ tests or Ravens tests, whatever, is trying to measure something that we call general intelligence, and we're not completely sure what that is, but it seems to be a correlation that emerges between from intelligence testing, and that it does have some predictive power for life outcomes.
So when researchers get in this field, there's both things they discover, right? And there's also guesses they have at how things work, right? That there's this correlation. This is an empirical finding. This isn't like a theory that came about, right? As far as I know, it was just something they discovered. And how does that mesh with a theory, right? Like the whole fluid intelligence versus crystal intelligence is one theory of how intelligence works. It's not the only one, by the way. Now, okay, so you have a test, like an IQ test, and you come up with a number. And then it's like, well, what use is this number, right? Like, who cares, right? And that's where you get into does it have predictive power, right? So just stepping back a tiny bit, if you have any kind of model and think this concept of IQ where like in physics, force equals mass times acceleration, Ohm's law that relates resistance to current to voltage. These are all models, right? And what use is a model, right? One use is that it can predict things that you consider interesting or useful, right? Like if I know this information, I can do better than I would at like just guessing at random, right?
Right.
The other use is it gives you a deep understanding of how the universe or reality works, right? Let's put aside the question of like, does this give us a deep understanding, like IQ test, of how the mind works or how the brain works or anything like that? People, that's like a large debate. The question a lot of people get to is like, if we know this number about a person, right? Can we do better than if we just guessed at random or like just guessed based on other information? Mm-hmm. And it seems like if you take 1,000 people and you make guesses for certain things for their IQ, like for example, let's say we take 11-year-olds, we know their IQ scored 11, and we try to predict their income at 35. Now, not across one person, because there's a good chance we could be wrong, right? But across 1,000 people, we do better than if we flipped a coin or rolled dice and picked at random, right?
Right.
So it's predictive in that sense. Now, the question is like, how good is it, right? Like sometimes these predictors, they're better than random, but they're not like super, super better than random, right? But like still better at random is useful. And sometimes if you take like say IQ or something else and you combine it with a few other things, like it's actually, you can get a pretty good predictor. And pretty good depends, right? Like in the social sciences, like
right.
The level of pretty good is much, much, much lower than you would get in like, say physics or, something like that, right?
Right. So can we talk about what some of these predictors are then that have cropped up in, and Michael, feel free to chime in anytime if you have anything that you want to add or in this, but because there are like a number of predictors that have cropped up, right? Like I believe like general health, life expectancy, like job performance. I think that there could be more.
So I mean,
okay, hold on, Charles. Hold on, Charles. So yeah, there's a long list of things that have been accumulating that I want to say. So I'm not going to even try and go back and go through the list now. It's become too long. Well, one thing I'd like to just go back to emphasize, though, is Charles was talking about, so talking a bit about the early history of IQ research or intelligence research, and was talking a bit about the air factor. And so something that's worth emphasizing, which isn't necessarily widely known, is that a lot of the statistical methods that we now widely use across a wide range of disciplines were actually developed by people like Francis Galton and Spearman to solve exactly these kind of problems. Like it was intelligence research that developed these sophisticated statistical methods precisely to deal with the potential of these kinds of errors. So that's something worth keeping in mind. Intelligence research has been leading the charge in terms of sophisticated statistical analysis in the social sciences. So that's something worth keeping in mind. Now, coming back to this issue of prediction, yeah, I can't remember exactly what ones you said, Patricia, but the ones that I know of are these scholastic achievement, job performance, lifetime income, lifetime health standards, longevity, and it's also and these ones may be a little complicated, but it also correlates with crime and divorce rates too, even though there might be more roundabout routes to explain how those particular phenomena correlate. And yeah, and the point isn't here that these are necessarily super high correlations, but they are the best. They're the best we have in terms of single variables. And I think Charles was referring to, if you bring other things like conscientiousness in and combine the two of them, then you start getting considerably more robust predictions.
Right. And I mean, so this is sort of the fact that you get these predictions. This is sort of like leads into my next point, saying that I would argue that that a good reason to carry out intelligence research, whether that would be what environmental factors affect it or whatnot, with that, if you can, let's say, like in the past, we've identified lead. Lead does not have a good effect on your general intelligence if you're exposed to lead when you were developing. And so if there are things in the environment that lead to people having lower IQs, that just from like a public health perspective, this is something that we should think about trying to rectify, because it will just help people do better in general and sort of lessen the public health burden. I think I've even seen some things that would say, like traffic accidents could be reduced. If people are living healthier, that's a good thing. So I think that you could make a good, would you guys agree that this could be a good argument just from like a public health debate, that we should be interested in trying to raise people's IQs, or sorry, intelligence?
I would say it's like some of this, it's not necessarily trying to raise people's IQ. It's trying to stop it from going down from, whatever potential they might have been born with, right? Like for example, like you mentioned one, being exposed to lead, right? I kind of think, and I hope I'm not wrong about this, I remember some example in the southern states where they, a lot of people had a pathogen. I think they were hookworms or something like that. And they went through a process where they, removed this kind of burden on the population there. And I think it had an appreciable effect, right? But like, having parasites, being exposed to lead, not get enough micronutrients, being exposed to like the chaos, like war and stuff like that, people defecating outside, there's all sorts of things that can negatively affect you as you're developing. And then this can be like through the mechanisms through the womb, or like when you're young and growing up and stuff like that. Some people argue that, one effect is that your IQ goes down. It's not really that it gets boosted. Now, there is a bit of research that I've seen that certain kind of exposure that you get within university, it's not saying it necessarily happens to happen there, but certain kind of exposure you might get in university can boost your IQ score a bit. Now, what does that mean? Like, that's another question, right? Like, does it have an effect? Like, I don't know. There's also things like if you get into what's the Flynn effect, right? People's IQ, like effective IQ scores, like compared against over time, seems to be increasing, right?
And, well, that's not exactly true, though, right?
I know. I had a point about this. We can talk about it now, or we can swing back to it.
Okay, let's get into it.
Okay. Well, so first we should just to like summarize what you said. So I think that the point we're trying to make, and maybe I didn't make it explicitly, but you can think of intelligence like you can think of height, isn't that maybe you have like a natural ceiling, and there are a lot of things that can happen in your development and growing up that can make you shorter than maybe your genetic potential.
Yeah. So yes, so there's a potential that you could realize if the environment's a certain way. Right. And if you don't necessarily get that environment, you might not reach that potential, right? And some of this might be unfortunate. Some of this might be useful in that it's part of an adaptation, right?
Right.
And so IQ seems like that's something like that. Right. Being exposed to certain negative things in environments lowers what you would get like from a potential, right?
Right. So Michael, do you want to tell us about the Flynn effect? Not to put you on the spot, but
yeah. Well, okay. Well, yeah. Actually, I just wanted to say a few more words on this last topic.
Sure, right? Sure, yeah.
In terms of, and I think you're making a really good point, and it's kind of the point that I was alluding to earlier. That I mean, you don't need to understand that that it can lead to deterioration of of people's intelligence to not want people to be exposed to toxins and parasites and things, because there's all kinds of other negative effects too.
Of course.
But maybe it would be a good idea for people to be cognizant of the fact that IQ is plays a really big role in terms of, or as soon as the potential play a really big role in terms of your success in life, and maybe avoiding environmental factors that are going to prevent people's achievement of their fullest potential is something that maybe needs to be emphasized more. When you consider that, I heard recently that something in the area of $100 billion was put into the Head Start program, which had virtually no effect at all. Right now, it had some effect in terms of quality, people becoming. It seemed to have been helpful. If I remember correctly, it seemed to have been helpful in terms of encouraging more conscientiousness, right? But in terms of IQ and long-term or intelligence and long-term impacts in terms of scholastic achievement had basically no impact at all. You know, if that $100 billion had been put into, you know, reducing toxins in, you know, people's environments, it could have actually made a difference, right? You know, so I think that being aware of this stuff is important in terms of public policy.
Yeah,
and there's way more to be said about that. But
right, and I mean, there's also the flip side too, is we could talk about as we age and experience cognitive decline, like some of this research could be helpful in terms of like trying to keep people as sharp as they can for as long, because I mean, that's a huge burden as well on, you know, family members and society and everything. So I mean, even if it's just a matter of trying to help curtail cognitive decline as we age, that would be hugely, you know, have a huge positive effect on a lot of people's lives.
Why are you looking at me when you say that?
Hey, yes. we're all staring down the barrel of that gun, Michael. Don't worry.
just to point it out, I mean, there are some things done, you know, in our part of the world that are helpful towards like helping people realize their, you know, potential for IQ, for example. I think wheat is fortified with iron and our salts is iodized, right? And that helps, like lack of those seems to cause issues with the developmental process that leads to, you know, you attaining your potential IQ. And we have that. And I mean, it's not to say it's just that, but I mean, those things do seem to have an effect. So yeah.
Right. Okay.
So
do we still want to touch on the Flynn effect?
Sure. So I guess what I would qualify, I mean, the way Charles had presented it was that, you know, people are getting smarter. So I mean, I guess we should explain a bit about the when these tests are redone, often they're renormed so that they want to have an average of 100. But what they found is that it appeared as though, and Flynn was not the first person to notice this, but he did a lot more research into it and probably explained it or gave insights into it or focused on trying to give insights into it more than most had. That it seemed like this renorming was moving up. Right, so 100, so to speak, was becoming more intelligent as time went by. Now, this I think, you know, I'm prepared to be corrected on this. I think that this is primarily a thing of the Western industrialized world. But there are a couple of qualifications there. First of all, it wasn't all, like we were talking before, that general intelligence, the G factor, is something that sort of is captured in all the different, like you have different tests. And then within the different tests, you have the different kind of functions, the different things you're testing, you know, memory or verbal ability or, you know, different kind of things, right? So the G is established through people, as Charles was saying, being good in all of these different things, not equally, but, you know, but if you're, you know, you're good in one, you're more likely to be good in others. But the Flynn effect was not represented in all these different categories. It's only represented in some of the categories, which is interesting. And the other thing is that, as far as I understand, it's actually not only is it slowing down pretty much everywhere, but in some countries in Europe, I think it's actually started reversing. So, you know, it's not quite clear what's going on. What has been going on with the Flynn effect is not sure what the cause is. Flynn has his explanations, but those are not by no means clear. Other people dispute what's going on. I know Linda Godfredson has argued that it's that it was as a consequence of lower stress on the immune system because of the reduction of pathogens in the post-World War II era, has allowed more, you know, nutritional energy to be directed into cognitive processes and this kind of thing. So, you know, so no one really knows what's going on. It's an interesting phenomenon, but I think too many people are way too quick to make too many assumptions about what's going on. It's not even clear that it's necessarily even an environmental process. It could be something else, because the whole time that people have been getting more intelligent, they've also been getting they've been getting taller too, right? So it made, you know, who knows? You know, we don't know exactly what's going on here.
Charles, anything to add?
Yeah. So there's debate over what the Flynn effect is, right? One explanation I've heard, I'm not saying this is what it is, but one explanation I've heard is that modernity is basically helping, you know, increase the score in IQ. Now, the question is like, does having a higher IQ score mean you're more intelligent in some way, right? That's a separate discussion. I guess maybe like a cartoon version of this explanation is that having a baby, stare at a wall all day is a lot less stimulating, like in terms of like the mind's growth, than sitting a baby in front of a TV, right? And you might think, well, TV rots the mind, but it seems to be, you could make the assumption or guess that maybe having that kind of stimulation helps with brain development somehow. I guess maybe just to touch on what Michael said a bit about the the renorming, just to put it in like more layman's terms. By definition, when I think it's within the UK, when they give an IQ test, the average is 100 by definition. The thing is, like, well, if you took 100, 10 years in the past versus 100 today, like, and is it higher or lower? Like, if you took a person today who got 100 and they would have taken the test 10 years ago, would they still have got 100? Right? It's assuming they got the same number of questions right. And the Flynn effect is basically that those people would have gone like much higher scores, right? And I think if you do some of it, it's like the people, if you go back far enough in the past, like they would, if they scored it, took the test today and got the same number right, they would be defined as mentally retarded. Now the question is like, were they like mentally retarded people today, right? And that's some of the debate, right? It's like, well, what does this really mean that the score is increasing? And like Michael's also correct, like it's slowed down in some places, it's reversed in some places. What does that mean? And it's the same thing like when you look at IQ scores, like what does it mean? What does it mean that you have this, right? Like where does this general factor come from, right? Like what, right. And this is part of what's debated.
Right, and I think some researchers have sort of argued that a lot of what different IQ tests are trying to measure is the ability to be able to think abstractly, and that a lot of schooling and education, even from a young age, is sort of helping you develop this ability to think abstractly. So it does, like education does help you perform better at IQ tests. It can't explain all of, like, I mean, there's only, do you know what I'm trying to say? It's not going to make you more intelligent necessarily, but that could be a contributor to the Flynn effect, in that like we're sort of training people to think in a certain way that's very useful in our society, whereas it may have not had as much value in the past.
It could be, right? I mean, it could be, and that's, both of you have sort of described Flynn's explanation in terms of the stimulation of the environment. But like, if I remember correctly, I think I'm right, one of the countries where you were seeing a reverse is in Austria. Now you're telling me in Austria there's people are getting less stimulating environments and not playing video games and all, like that doesn't seem to make sense, right? If that's the explanation, right? I mean, there could be some independent set of variables, obviously, right? But I mean, it's a problem for the theory.
Yeah, it could be that there's, I'm guessing, I don't know, but like it seems possible that maybe there's some kind of effect from the modern environment that boosts it, and maybe it plays out over a number of generations, but there could be a maximum that this boosting can happen, right? And maybe they're hitting a plateau.
Yeah,
like I don't know actually,
right?
That's one explanation that you hear.
Yeah.
I was thinking of sort of changing the topic a little bit towards evolution and intelligence. Is anything else I want to say about sort of the theory of intelligence before we sort of change directions, or would that be okay with you guys?
I just want to, in terms of the impact, the importance of this as impact. Sure. I want to throw out one statistic that I think gives some sense of the magnitude and the importance of what we're talking about, and I put it out carefully, because we have so far managed to avoid talking about race, and of course a lot of the problems here get caught up because of what the research has shown about differences in groups that are often identified as being race. And I don't want to get into the whole discussion of it, so we should do some episodes on race, but I don't want to get into it deeply today. But by adding that variable to one kind of statistic, I think it gives you a sense of the magnitude. So back in the 90s, and when Herrnstein and Murray published the bell curve, they had a statistic, and I think I have the numbers exactly right, but they're pretty close and not exactly right. They said if you compare to that time, and they were using the longitudinal study of youth, which was one of these large surveys. I think it was similar in size to the GSS, actually. And what they found was that if you compare averages, blacks earned 77 cents on the dollar compared to whites. However, if you controlled for intelligence, blacks earned 98 cents on the dollar compared to whites. So, I mean, that's huge, right? And understanding that. And by the way, I've tried to look that up. That was the 90s. I looked up, and actually the average, blacks have improved in terms of average. I think in the low 80s compared to whites now. But it's still, when you control for intelligence, I mean, you're talking about, cents on the dollar. It virtually disappears, the difference. So this is important in terms of understanding the impact of intelligence itself in terms of your own life outcomes. And it's also important for emphasizing the importance of taking it into account when you're thinking in terms of social analysis and public policy. So I think that sort of puts an exclamation point on all that whole discussion. No comments?
I mean, okay, like, I don't have any comments to say. I think that probably this like warrants another episode, because I've got like a lot of, I don't necessarily disagree. I've got a lot more questions and stuff based on some of the stuff we've read. But no, your point's well taken. Charles, anything?
Yeah, so I would say, for example, I mean, the word race.
No, let's not go down that road. You know exactly what I mean, right? You know exactly how it's parsed, right? We're not getting into a debate about what race means, right? I'm happy to do that another day, but I mean, the point is, in terms of black and white, we know how this is parsed, and we know that we come out with statistical differences, and we know that if you can, well, according to Murray and Bernstein and others who have done this more recently, if you use those largely self-identified categories, then you come up with these differences in terms of outcome, depending on whether you do or do not control for intelligence.
And you're talking about in America, right?
Yeah, this is on the States, yeah.
Right. So you wouldn't necessarily be extrapolating that.
Well, I would absolutely extrapolate it. Not necessarily in terms of race, but in terms of differences of IQ. The point here isn't my point isn't differences in race. My point is differences in IQ, right?
Yeah.
By adding another variable, you can get sort of you can get sort of a more of a visual perception of how the two groups. If you have something if you can just say high IQ people tend to earn more money than low IQ people, okay, then fine, I understand that. But if you add in another variable here, you can create sort of a set where you can sort of compare them in two different dimensions and see how the difference of the outcome, if you can control for IQ, it makes a significant difference.
Yeah,
and to be fair, I haven't read the bell curve, so I actually can't really say here or there much about it.
I think part of what you're touching on is like you have correlation, but there's also causation, for example, right? And you don't necessarily have causation when you have correlation. So what's making this happen? And I think pointing out the IQ thing is maybe that's more causative than the other factors that people suggest, right? Yeah, I mean, in terms of if you think earned income or job performance, this seems to be a better predictor. But of course, it's not that great of a predictor either. When you look at some of these things, I mean, in an absolute sense compared to other fields, but it seems to be more relevant a lot of times when you're trying to figure some of the stuff out.
Right, and I guess, I mean, to be fair, there also is a question of why. Actually, you know what? No, I was going to make another point, but I think that I changed my mind.
That's a host provocative, right?
There is more to be said, but maybe not in this episode per se. Okay. Can we move on to evolution?
Yes.
All right, great. So this is where I think things get really interesting. So it's not, things have been very interesting all along, don't get me wrong, but bear with me here. We go. So I think that it goes without saying that obviously evolution was selecting for intelligence because humans are here. There is a big difference in cognitive ability between humans and chimpanzees. So obviously this was a strong selection pressure in the past. But in one of the books I was reading to prepare for this episode, it was sort of it was Satoshi Kanazawa's book, The Intelligence Paradox. And so this is his argument and not mine that I thought was really interesting. And he's saying that the fact that IQ is highly heritable, so we're using heritable in the behavioral genetic sense, meaning that there is a lot of variation in the population. The fact that it is highly heritable and being that we have so much variation suggests that from an evolutionary perspective, intelligence is not that important anymore. It's not important anymore in that, sorry, I'm not making this point very good. It's just that if there was a strong selection pressure, you would expect evolution to be selecting for, you would have less variation because evolution would have selected for the trait that was most successful. And the fact that you've got such a big bell curve of variation in humans means that there's not a strong selection pressure for intelligence.
I don't know if that, I mean, like, I understand what you're saying. I don't know if that's necessarily the case. Like, it's a good argument. Like, I'm not saying this is what it is, but I can imagine another scenario. What happens if intelligence is a costly signal of something, right?
Ooh, yes, I have thoughts about that.
Yeah. So I mean, if intelligence is a costly, signal, and making it costly tends to make it more reliable, right? If it's, so say for example, I'm not saying this is what it is, but I'm just suggesting something. Let's say it's a costly signal of developmental stability, right? Like, do your genes create, good developmental systems that, would give you a stable result? And meaning, like, say you had like, you're not just twins, there's like, say 50 of you, and you were in like the same womb or different wombs, and you just kind of developed, do you get good results most of the time? Like, maybe intelligence is something like that. In that case, it might be selected for, but you won't necessarily get everyone getting like, a max result or something like that.
Right. Well, I mean, I think also like a costly signal, I don't know if this necessarily, it's not a costly signal, but it would be a signal of sort of health, right? Because I think that IQ would be something to suffer if you, were raised in circumstances that, had a lot of adverse health effects, sort of like height, right? So like high intelligence would sort of signal that you're healthy, vital.
So it's not to say it's not noisy, right? I mean, there can be a lot of other things mixed in with a developmental process signal, right? Like, for example, like how you grew up, whether you got enough nutrients, but like even those type of things can affect you when you go to reproduce with someone else. Like maybe the the female more than the male, but those things can have an effect. I can say one of the guesses I've heard at what this Spearman factor might be. The guess I've heard is that maybe what you're seeing with IQ is a result of mutation load, right? So all individuals have mutations. So you get, roughly half your genes from your mother, half your genes from the father, except there's some that your parents didn't have, right? And they're just like mutations, they're slight changes. Mutations are absolutely necessary for evolutionary adaptation in the long term, but most mutations are slightly harmful, right? So, you without those mutations and you with those mutations, so you with those mutations, you're a bit shorter, you're a bit uglier, you're a bit dumber than you, and a bit like, more sickly than you would have been without those mutations, right? And maybe what you're seeing that's a result of what you're seeing as IQ and this correlation between height and, health and all that stuff is just the effect of how much mutation load, like how many of these harmful mutations do you have? So this is one explanation I've heard. I don't know how much evidence there is behind this. I didn't really look into it, but it seems like an interesting thing to try to investigate.
Right. I mean, I guess my point was more that in our society, intelligence is highly valued. I mean, like we said, all these predictors mean that you are probably going to do well at your job. You're probably going to accumulate more income. Da, 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 da. So, but there's perhaps an evolutionary mismatch between what our society values highly and maybe what, I mean, I know evolution doesn't value, but what evolution is necessarily selecting for.
Well, can I jump
Michael,
in?
please.
So a couple things here. First of all, when we're talking, it's good to keep in mind when we're talking about high intelligence people doing better, better achievement vocationally. It's worth keeping in mind that in fact, more intelligent people do better at everything, right? Like even low skilled jobs, like a high intelligence mechanic I mean, maybe it's not a low skill job actually, but certainly a mechanic is with higher intelligence is going to do better than one with lower intelligence. And in fact, I think there's even been studies on hunter-gatherers. Hunter-gatherers with higher intelligence actually are more successful than one with low. But the point is that as the cognitive complexity of the job increases, the disparity between how good high intelligence people are and low intelligence people becomes more dramatic, right? So as the jobs become more challenging, the high intelligence people become even more successful.
Right.
Now the mentioned the bell curve earlier, and part of what's often lost because people focus on like the one chapter that dealt with race, right? But really the point of the book was something else. And Murray has continued to sort of follow this line of exploration, this idea that we're developing a sort of cognitive elite because our society becomes more complex, and there's these more complex jobs, and the more complex jobs, then fewer people can do them, and therefore you get paid more for doing them, and you're getting this sort of cognitive elite. These people are way more intelligent than the rest of the population and spend all their time with other people who are way more cognitively high functioning.
But they're not necessarily having more kids, though.
Well, I'm coming to this. This is exactly what I'm coming to. Right? So your position is that this is not being selected for evolutionarily because
they're not a strong selection pressure.
Yeah, but because and Kanazawa makes this point is that high intelligence people, particularly high intelligence women, have fewer children, and the whole argument, of course, is that the point of evolution is to create more, the point, and from a selfish gene perspective, the point is to put more copies of your genes in future generations, right? So on the face of it, you could say, well, low intelligent people are outcompeting high intelligent people on that level. But of course, you have to take into account life history theory and different sexual strategies. I mean, high intelligent people may have fewer children, but they can invest a whole heck of a lot more resources in them. And low intelligent people, I'm willing to bet, I don't know this for a fact, but I'm willing to bet that they invest less per child. That would be what you would predict, right? So, evolution in a sense, I'm always suspicious of people who are telling me what evolution is doing today, right? We will know what evolution is doing today, thousands of years from now. Then we'll know what evolution is doing today. So it's not clear which is the more successful strategy in the long run. Just having more children doesn't necessarily mean in the long run that your progeny will survive more. It's not guaranteed at all.
Certainly.
It's also like what's happened in the last 200 years is kind of a blip in terms of evolution. Like it might not be significant.
That's true too.
Right. Fair enough. Right. Yeah. All right. What else would I like to touch on in this? Is there anything else that you guys would really like to? I would like to get into a little bit of the practicality of what IQ might mean for somebody watching this video or intelligence, and I would say pretty much nothing.
What do you mean? I don't know what you mean by that. What do you mean?
All right. I guess is what we're trying to say is I think that we've sort of talked about what intelligence is, and I don't think that there's much good research to support the position that there's anything that you can do to raise your general intelligence or to make yourself more generally intelligent. So I would
You could do all those clever games that people play, right? All those, those games people play on computer to raise their
intelligence. I know. So
Patricia, they advertise that it makes you smarter. Are you telling me they're not telling me the truth?
False advertising, Michael. It's false advertising. There's no evidence to support any of that.
There is application of intelligence testing, even if they don't necessarily call it that. For example, I think the military gives some kind of test before admitting people into the military. And
it's useful to evaluate other people's intelligence. I'm saying, is it useful to evaluate your own intelligence?
Or is it useful does it increase your intelligence? I thought that was more the point, right?
Right. Well, I would say like to worry about your own intelligence doesn't matter. You're stuck with it. You just need to play the hand that you were dealt. Unless you just want to make yourself feel good and smug, You could probably take some crappy internet test that's not, I mean, like, I think Charles touched on this earlier. If you really want to know the proper assessment of your cognitive ability, this is going to take multiple tests that are going to be long, you know, over like the course of time, and that some little 20-minute internet thing is probably not going to tell you.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, what's clear is that the sort of pencil and paper, sort of, as they used to call it, I guess it's all online now, tests, you know, really don't give an accurate. To get a really accurate score, you need to have like a face-to-face, you know, personally managed test, right, to really get some kind of reliable result.
So I would put internet IQ tests in kind of the same category that I would put internet personality tests and sort of astrological categorizations and women's magazine quizzes, in that it's fine if you just want some sort of vain self-indulgence to like enjoy, like, I don't know, learning about yourself or whatever. But I don't think that it really has any bearing on anything.
There are some effects that you could have, right? Like if you want to help your children out, or your potential children, right? One of them could be like where you choose to live. And like, you know, obviously like not everyone has those options. Like growing up in the developing world where it's safe and comfortable can make it so that, you know, your children could reach their potential more, like in a more likely sense, right? That's a thing that most people don't have a choice over. Another one is choosing who you choose to have children with. Of course, like that's more. See, that thing is like, that's more if you can tell or get a sense of the intelligence of whoever you have children with, right? If you live in the developed world and the person is probably closer to the potential, you can make a good judgment. If you live in a place that's not developed, right? A place where there's a large impact of whether like they got enough micronutrients, whether they had pathogens, a person with a, you know, a lower IQ score might have a much higher potential IQ. And you might not, it might be very difficult to make that decision, right?
Hey, have you guys seen, I only saw it alluded to somewhere, and I'm not sure what the research says, that many sort of the like genes that you may be correlated with general intelligence is located on the X chromosome rather than the Y.
I've not heard that, no.
So I kind of think I might have heard something like this. One thing to keep in mind with this is that for females, they, you know, have 2 copies of the X chromosome. Males have 1, right? And if a male has anything broken there, then that can decrease they might be able to decrease IQ. Basically, you don't have anything to kind of make up for it, right? And if you accept, and this is a bit of a leap, and I'm not saying it's a bad one to make, but if you accept that maybe some of the effect you see from this, you know, this factor in the data, this general intelligence, is a result of mutation load. Mutations on the X chromosome for males would probably be much worse than for females. And think, for example, color blindness, right? I think the gene for seeing red color is on the X chromosome. Color blindness and for, you know, red color is, I think, very rare in women. And why? Because they have 2 X chromosomes. If one of them is broken, you know, you'll have another one. You're probably okay, right? But for men, color blindness of that kind is much higher. And why? Because they have 1 copy. If that's busted, you're colorblind in that sense, right? That might be it. Yeah, I mean, there's other things you can get into too. There's actually a long time ago, like I was into the research around intelligence, and when I studied that, like I also came across the correlation between higher IQ and what some might have called Asperger's or autism. Like, and there are even scenes like they've found some genes that are related to this. And there was one study that suggested, I think the guy, maybe it was Crespi, I think that was maybe his paper. He found that there was a large overlap between the genes they found are implicated in autism / Asperger and the genes for higher intelligence. Now, the question is, I know there's also debate, like, what do you mean by autism? What do you mean by Asperger's, right?
Well, it's a continuum, right? It's not necessarily.
Well, I don't even mean that. I mean, the way it gets defined, there's certain traits, behavioral traits that people have. And I think if you have like 3 of these, then they classify you for that. And are all the people who get classified for this, is there the same kind of thing going on in their mind or their brain or in their body that manifests this? And that's debated, right? Like for some individuals, for example, there seems to be deletions along, I think, like chromosome 22 or something like that, like in different places, right? Is that the same as some of the other things you've seen, right? There's also seems to be a phenomenon where some, I don't know if you call them counselors and maybe psychiatrists or whoever, they will give a child a diagnosis of autism rather than something else because it's easier to get government support in terms of funding and stuff like that for a child that's diagnosed with autism rather than other things, right? So you might get many more individuals that have this that don't actually have the necessarily the same thing. So it seems to be a bit complex. Like, what do you mean by this particular thing, right?
Right.
But that was, I mean, like that research, Crespi, I think, what's the guy's name? Who's that big researcher that does a lot of autism related stuff? Simon Baron Cohen, or
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
yeah. So he also, some of his papers, like, he finds that, and they're not the only ones. I mean, there's other ones. I just don't remember the other names off the top of my head. I always found that an interesting aspect of research. So yeah.
Another thing we probably should mention. I'm getting a weird echo. Okay, I hope this isn't going to come through on the recording. Anyways, another thing worth mentioning here that we haven't mentioned is that the new genetic, because of increased computational power over the last decade and a half or so basically the century, it's now become possible to do much more sophisticated genetic studies, and to do these things called these gene-wide associated studies, because we've come to realize that things like intelligence you can't find one or two or half a dozen genes that explain, and it's going to turn out to be hundreds and probably thousands of genes that combine in different ways to make the difference in terms of intelligence. And we're actually making progress on that. I can't remember. I think that they got up to the point where they believe they can find like 10% now that can explain the difference in heritability or something like that. I don't remember exact numbers, but the progress is being made, and it maybe as soon as 5 years from now, we may be able to identify the majority of the genes and the particular combinations of genes, polygenetic or polymorphic, that explain intelligence. And a lot of this stuff, a lot of this nature, environment, gene stuff will be put to rest at that point.
Yeah. So what you talk about is the polygenic score. There's been some people researching this. It's an interesting concept. Just one thing to note, and this isn't obviously for you, but when people say explain in that sense, it means it in this statistical sense, which it doesn't mean cause. Like the GWAS basically looks for correlation. Like there are all sorts of difficulties that come out this. Like you might find a stretch of DNA, and a lot of the time, or some of the times when they use this DNA, they don't get like the whole genome. They just get parts of it. And they might find that, okay, on this block, people who have this little variation here, you might find also have this other variation. There's really this other piece of the DNA, this other gene that's causing. It's just like those things seem to go together for whatever reason, because DNA sometimes comes in larger clumps, right? And some of this stuff that they're finding, in terms of the GWAS, might not be causative. It might not be that. It might be like other things that are kind of implicated in this.
Would it be fair to say that, like, from a practical point of view, that, I mean, like, we talk about like genes a lot, and people, we talked about this in the beginning of the episode, get a little uppity because it makes it feel like everything's sort of predetermined. But would it be fair to say that from a practical point of view, like, genes are sort of probabilistic instead of deterministic? Like, it might make you more likely to behave a certain way or to have certain traits, but it doesn't necessarily mean that unless it's, like, there are a couple genes that do that, like Huntington's, right? Like, you're going to get Huntington's if you have this gene. But most other genes, it's not necessarily, like, we know what they do most of the time, but that there is sort of a, like a variety of
So there
expressions.
It is in a probabilistic sense. Also, there seems to be structure to that probabilistic sense. Like sometimes it's like, you have this trait and you might reach certain potential or might not, based on like, just kind of like a randomness type thing, a kind of noise, right? In other cases, there might be an adaptation at play, right? Like you have this gene in this environment, your developmental system might kind of configure you this way to be more attuned to that environment, but in other environments, it might configure you another way. And that doesn't seem to be like although there's noise often in a lot of these processes, some of this variation you see in the expression of a gene is not simply the result of noise. It's also that's working as planned. It's that it's tuning you and adapting you to some kind of environment.
Yeah, you see, I'm always a little uncomfortable with the genes are just probabilistic statement. Not to say that it's technically wrong, but that I think it gives people a kind of optimism that they're desperately seeking that isn't really well founded. I mean, and we always know when we're coming to the end of an episode when somebody says, "Well, that sounds like that's for another episode." And that may be the case. I think this actually is a discussion for another episode. But I just want to say, I mean, like to me, if I understand this stuff, maybe I don't, but if you have a particular genotype and you put it in a particular environment, and if you could, like from a God's eye point of view, you knew all the details of that genotype and you knew all the details of that environment, you would know what phenotype you were going to get.
And that's why I put in the caveat, though, that from a practical point of view, because I do agree with you in that, but what I'm saying is that like we can't possibly like know all the environmental things. So if you're just thinking about it and be like, oh crap, like I've got these genes that may have been linked to some outcome, that does not mean necessarily like we don't have enough information, we can't make that prediction at this point.
Yeah, we don't know enough about the genes, and we certainly don't know enough about the environment.
Right. So I'm just sort of talking in like from a practicality, like if you're just like, oh great, I don't have any of these genes that they identified to make me super smart, it's like, well,
yeah. And this is why we believe, and the concept of free will is complicated, right? But I'll just use it in sort of a crude version of it for this purposes, right? That's one reason why people can believe in the idea of free will, because there is all this variability, because we don't have the knowledge that you would need to eliminate the illusion of free will.
There is one kind of structure that's being missed in that, I think, that explanation. So let's say you take the exact same genome and the outside environment is the same. It seems like there's a source of noise, and this could just be like thermal differences at the molecular level.
But how is that an environment?
Let me get to that. Just let me explain first. So, for example, you could have and they've seen this sometimes in twins, right? Like some genotypes give you something that's very, very similar each time, and they know, for example, in some twins and triplets and quadruplets and all that, for example, like face symmetry. Like the face symmetry will be spot on, like most of the time. And in some genotypes, that's not the case. You have this large variability, right? And it seems like you could think of this in terms of like how does, for example, thermal differences, how does it affect the phenotype, like the physical phenotype or the behavioral phenotype you have at the end, right? And this is sometimes described as noise, right? And what it seems like is that different genotypes are impacted by certain kinds of noise in different ways. Like some of them are, like very similar, like, they're very resistant to noise, some of them aren't. And you can think of this also in terms of stability of the developmental system. Now, I have read some people's work where they consider this noise absolutely bad. I know, for example, like if you think from machine learning AI point of view, that noise or randomness or whatever you want to call it is actually useful in a lot of cases. And often systems don't work properly unless you have this kind of noise.
Okay, but
I had a hard time following that.
But for our purposes, it doesn't matter whether it's good or bad. The point is that's environment. That's just another part of the environment. When I say all the environment, I mean all the environment, right? Down to every last atom, right? Where every last atom's position and motion is, right? If that's what I mean by the God's eye point of view. If you knew every detail of the environment and every detail of the genotype, you would know exactly the phenotype you would get. And if not, then I have to start believing in God or some mysterious force, because otherwise I don't see how biological explanation works anymore.
Yeah, assuming the universe is deterministic, yes, that would be the case.
All right. I'm going to take that slight pause. Oh, there's even more stuff that I might have to save for another episode. I didn't even get to pat myself on the back for the role of female choice in selecting for intelligence, but we didn't even get into Jeffrey Miller stuff or anything, but that maybe we'll save for another time. But yeah, so I think that, does anyone want to do a little, I guess I'm the host, I should do a sum up, right, of what we've learned today?
Yes, you should. Yeah.
You're stuck with the hand you've been dealt. It's not the end of the world. I think that we didn't actually say this, but there's a lot of other things that factor into a healthy and fulfilled life. And so things like conscientiousness and, being nice to people, this will get you far in life. And so I don't think if you're like me and you always have a little bit of a chip on your shoulder that you're not quite as clever as you'd like to be, it's not the end of the world. But I would just say that, if you bothered to listen to this whole episode, you're obviously a very intelligent person. So
That's right.
So would you guys like to add anything else? Oh, I'd like to recommend the books that I read for this episode. Stuart Ritchie has a fabulous book that's really readable and really to the point, and that is called Intelligence, All That Matters. All That Matters. And that's fabulous. Thank you, Michael, for recommending that to me. And I also talked about Satoshi Kanazawa's The Intelligence Paradox, which for the most part I liked, but it's a good read either way anyways. Yeah, anything else to add, guys?
Yeah, there's another book I might recommend. I mean, before I started getting into books on this, I read a lot of papers. But one book that was recommended to me by a friend many, many years ago was the Cambridge Handbook of Intelligence.
Oh my goodness. It's probably a very good book, but it just sounds so dry.
I like it.
I'm sure you did, and this is why you're so knowledgeable, Charles, that these are your sources. So great. I think that's all I've got.
All right, then let's say goodbye.
All right, thanks, guys. It was a lot of fun.
All right, thanks, Patricia. Bye. Bye, Charles.
See you.